Hi, in today's video I'm going to be covering setting up an encrypted ZFS root on Ubuntu and also creating encrypted datasets to store your passwords and sensitive files. So first of all, what you need to do is actually start with a clean install of Ubuntu. And there's a very good video I come across by this guy Chris here that references the setup that you need to do. And basically, in this video, he covers some tips by this other guy here, whose name I've forgotten for the moment, Sean Reifenschneider. There we go. And basically, what you need to do to get ZFS set up and set up encryption is obviously you need to start with a fresh install of Ubuntu. So if you've already got Ubuntu set up and you want to try this, back up all your data to an external hard drive and burn off a Ubuntu CD and follow along. Now basically what you have to do is when you start Ubuntu up from the live session, you can do try Ubuntu, which will bring up a desktop environment so that you can check everything's working before you install it. Now after you've clicked the try Ubuntu button, what you need to do is open a terminal and edit this file, user share ubiquity sys-setup. And then in that file, what you need to do is search for zpool create. And basically what you do is before the line that says zpool create, you do echo my password and a pipe where my password is obviously your password in single quotes. And then what you do is you append these lines to the bottom of the zpool create bit of code. And as I said, you check this video here and he goes through all the steps, but I'm just showing you the actual text. Now once you've done that, basically you save the file and then you run the installer as normal and you select use entire disk and the option to use ZFS. Now what's going to happen then is if I just come across to my setup notes, is you will have ZFS encryption set up on Ubuntu. When you boot into Ubuntu, you'll actually be prompted to decrypt the drive using your password. Now if you don't set up, if you don't do this, your drive will be completely unencrypted with ZFS, which isn't a good idea. So what we're actually going to be doing is we've set up full disk encryption using the method I've just shown you. And now what we're going to do is create encrypted ZFS datasets. And what that will allow you to do is be able to mount and unmount the dataset and see the files there. And what we'll be doing is we'll be using this instead of a LUKS encrypted container, because if you set up Ubuntu with ZFS, it's not using LUKS, so you won't have LUKS and the crypt setup command installed. So what I'm going to do is actually show you how easy this is to set up. And the first thing that we need to do is actually list the ZFS datasets. So once we boot it in, what I'll do is I'll do ZFS list, and you can see what it has is two pools. It has the boot pool, which is B pool, and it has the R pool, which contains the root file system and your home directory. So basically there are two ZFS pools with data sets inside them. So we've got the B pool, which is the boot pool, and the R pool. And if I scroll down here, you'll see we've got lots of data sets for user var, lib, network services. These are all data sets. And at the bottom, you'll see this one that I've created, R pool data, which is mounted to a mount directory in my home directory. And by default, you won't have this. We were going to create this now. So after we've listed the ZFS datasets, what we first need to do is actually create the mount point where we're going to mount the dataset to. So we'd run the mkdir command with the -p flag, which creates the directory if it doesn't exist. And we're going to be creating a directory called mount in our home directory. Now you can create this directory any way you like and call it whatever you like, but I've always just created a mount directory. And you'll, if I just come back across here, you can see I have a mount directory, and if I look inside the mount directory, there's nothing there, and that's because it's not mounted. So what we're going to do is say we create that mount point, and then after that what we're going to do is we're going to create the encrypted pool and set the mount point in with one command. So the reason why this is really cool is because what happens is you create a data set that has a encryption password which can be completely different from your root ZFS password, and you will be prompted to unlock it when you boot up. So when you boot up, what will happen is you'll be prompted for your main ZFS root password and also for the password for the encrypted dataset as well. And once you're actually logged in, you can unmount it and mount the ZFS dataset, and the password will actually be cached in memory for the session. And what this means is it's really useful for being able to put your passwords in, unmount the dataset so that they're not visible in case you get hacked or anything, and then just mount the dataset when you need it. So what we're going to do now is create the dataset and set the mount point. So what we're going to do is run sudo ZFS create -o encryption equals on. Now by default, I think it uses AES256 encryption for the dataset, but you can actually specify other encryption algorithms as well. And we'll then be going to use the -o option in the key format as a passphrase. You can also actually use a file instead of a passphrase, so you can actually create a file using DD to use as a key for the encryption, which should mean that you can actually store the key on a separate USB drive and plug it in when you boot up, for example. But I haven't tried that as yet, so I'm just using a passphrase for the moment. So what we do is say we run sudo ZFS create, turn the encryption on, specify we're using a key format passphrase, and then we set the mount point. So the mount point needs to be the full path to the directory that we created that we're going to mount the ZFS dataset on. And finally, down here, you can see this is the mount point. In the next line, we're going to be creating the dataset in rpool/data. Now, if I switch back to the terminal and show you the layout of the ZFS setup on Ubuntu, as I said, you'll see that there are two pools. There's the boot pool, the B pool, and there's the R pool. So each of these then has data sets inside them. So we've got the root data set, and then further down here we have the user data set, which is where our home directory is actually stored. Now, the important thing about the encryption is that the encryption will encrypt any data sets underneath it. So if I was to create another data set under rpool data, that would also have encryption. And if you turn the encryption on, you can't turn it off again. And also the other thing to note is if you do a ZFS send and receive, I don't think you can send data from an encrypted pool to an unencrypted pool. So that's just some few notes, but what we're doing is we're creating a data set in the rpool ZFS pool called data. And I said the reason why we're creating a separate data set is because the encryption would flows down into the following data set. So we don't want to create anything in user data and potentially mess up anything in that data pool. So we create the rpool data ZFS data set. You can call it whatever you like. But as I said, what we're doing is with this one line of code, we create the data set with encryption, with a passphrase, the mount point, and we specify the data set we're going to create. And the important thing I've found when doing this is you can create a data set and set the mount point afterwards. But what I found is that that actually caused some issues. The files weren't showing up for me. So what we do is we run this command sudo zfs -o encryption on -o key format passphrase -o the mount point, and then the ZFS dataset we're going to be creating. And we're obviously creating it in the rpool ZFS pool because you can't, the pool has to exist before you can create a dataset inside it. So once we've done that and we run that command, you'll actually be prompted to enter a password and then to verify that password. Now, once you've done that, the next step that we need to do is actually change the permissions on the mount point to your username. So in this section down here, what we're going to be doing is running sudo with the chown command with the -r flag, which stands for recursive. And this is where you would replace username in this command with your actual username. So we're going to be changing the mount point's permissions to our username because we created the mount point with the ZFS command as using sudo. The directories will be created as root, which means that by default you wouldn't be able to copy anything into the mount point without sudo, which is no good. So we changed the permissions using chown so that they're our user. And then once we've done that, we also need to change mod the permissions to 700 for security. So we'll run change mod 700 /mount. And again, this can be any directory on your system that you want. Now, once we've done that, what we need to be able to do is actually mount the dataset and unmount it. And I said, what happens is once you've set this up and you boot into Ubuntu, what happens is you're prompted for the ZFS root encryption password. You enter that. You will then be prompted for the password for this data set as well, and it will prompt you. It will say, rpool data password, and you put that in, and then it will boot up. And once you've booted up, the data set will be mounted in your mount directory. So let's have a look and see how this works. So at the moment, there's nothing in the mount directory. But if I run sudo zfs mount, and what you need to do is actually specify the pool and the data set we're going to mount. So we don't specify the mount point, as you'd normally say, is, mount, this mount point. We use the ZFS mount command and the data set. So we'll run sudo ZFS mount rpool data. It's going to prompt me for my sudo password. And if we have a look in there, you can now see that is my password store. That is my store of sensitive information that I don't want lying around on the computer. I don't want text files with my passwords lying around. So what this allows me to do is mount the directory and unmount it. And if you noticed, I didn't actually have to enter the password for the dataset, and the reason for that is because, as I said, when I booted up the computer, it prompted me for the root password and the dataset password, and what it seems to do is it caches the password in memory for this session. So I can now sudo dfs umount. It's not unmount, the command is umount. So to mount, it's mount, and to unmount, it's umount. And then we do rpool data. We have a look in the mount directory. We can see the directory is gone. So what I'll do is I'll just run this again and show you the ZFS list command. So if I run ZFS list, you'll see that the dataset is mounted on home user mount folder. And if I run the mount command, you will also see down here the rpool data is mounted here, and you can see the attributes that it's got. So what I'll do is I'll just unmount that again, sudo zfs umount rpool data. You can see that's gone. And basically, the advantage of this is that you don't have to use LUKS. And the problem with using LUKS to create an encrypted container is that you actually have to create a physical file with DD, use a loopback device, and sort of mount the file system and encrypt it, and it's actually a bit of a pain to set up. And on FreeBSD, what you can do is you can use ZFS and Jelly, and say the issue is the same thing with that. You also have to sort of create a file and then sort of mount it on a loopback device and encrypt it with Jelly, and have to create a script to do this. But the advantage of this is very simple to set up. To say you need to set up a fresh install of Ubuntu. You have to obviously install ZFS on root, and if you're doing that, I would recommend following this guide and this video on how to create the encrypted ZFS root pool. The encrypted ZFS drive setup, because otherwise, if you're just using ZFS, it's going to be unencrypted. And as I said, because we're using ZFS, what will happen is it won't install LUKS and the crypt setup command on Ubuntu. So if you've got a script like I do, where I was using LUKS to create an encrypted container, it's not going to work unless you sort of install LUKS. And I'm not even sure if LUKS and ZFS would play nicely together. So using this method lets you use the ZFS native encryption, set it up with one command really easily, and say when you set this up, what you need to do during the install, just to recap, is you click the Try Ubuntu button, you edit this file, you search for zpool create, and before zpool create you put echo and then my password. So my password would be in single quotes your password, and you pipe it into the zpool create command, and before the last line of the command you insert these lines. And basically what that will do is when you run the Ubuntu installer and you select ZFS use entire disk, it will then set it up using the password that you've added, and when you boot up the computer, you'll be prompted to enter that password to unlock the drive. You'll get a little thing saying ZFS encrypted drive or something, and and this is necessary so that you can then set up the encrypted containers that we're going to use as a password store. I'll put links to these two articles and this video under the video. It's very simple to set up. You actually only need to come through it's not until about halfway through this video that it gets into the setup, and it literally takes a few minutes. And I said, once you've done that, you'll be able to create encrypted datasets, and I'll leave a link to this document under the video as well. And in a second, I'll just go through some notes that I've come across on setting up Ubuntu on the Dell XPS15 2019 model, and some issues I've sort of come across and how I sort of resolved them. But just to recap, basically what we did was, first of all, we listed the datasets, and as I said, you see that there are two pools. There's the boot pool and the R pool. After that, we created the mount point in our home directory with the mkdir command. After that, we then created the dataset in the R pool ZFS pool and set the mount point at the same time. With sudo ZFS create -o encryption equals on, -o key format equals passphrase, -o setting the mount point, and most importantly down here is setting the pool, the dataset that we're creating in the R pool. And this could be called anything. I'm just calling it data. You know, you could call it secrets, encryption, or whatever. But that draws attention to it. So something more generic like data is probably a better solution. And to say you can set the mount point anywhere you like. And once you've done this, once you run this command, as I said, you'll be prompted to create a passphrase, enter it, and then you'll have to verify it again. After that, the next step was we had to chown the directory, the mount point, so that it's under our username instead of root. So we ran sudo chown -r for the recursive flag, and username : username, where username is your username on the computer, and the mount point. Once we've done that, that sets the permissions correctly, and then for added security, we change mod the permissions to 700. And instead, once you've done all that, and you boot into Ubuntu, you'll be prompted for the passphrase during the boot up sequence, and then you can basically mount and unmount the dataset really simply with one line that's easy to remember: sudo ZFS mount and the name of the pool and the dataset we're going to mount. And as I said, this will then allow us to mount the dataset that's encrypted. Our pool data. See there. See, because I'm using sudo, that sudo hashes your password for a period of time. I think it's about 5 minutes or something. And you see, I didn't have to enter my passphrase because it's already cached in memory. And basically, what this allows me to do is, say I want to log into a site, I can mount the encrypted data set, find my password, log in, and then basically unmount it again. CFS mount all data, and the secret information is now gone. And that's just really useful. Instead of using something like VeraCrypt, or which is like a successor to TrueCrypt, or having to faff about with Lux, you know, this is built in. And the other thing I should mention is the reason I'm using Ubuntu and not Debian is because the ZFS setup on Ubuntu is baked into the kernel, whereas with Debian it's a DKMS sort of, you know, userland module kind of thing that you've actually got to build yourself and install and set up. There's a big long list of commands on the Debian wiki about setting this up. So a lot more work to do if you want to use Debian as opposed to Ubuntu. So I would just recommend using Ubuntu because the reason I'm actually using Ubuntu is because, as I said, I'm running a new machine, the Dell XPS15 2019 model, and Ubuntu works perfectly on that. They've actually, got partnerships with Dell and everything to make sure it all works. And I use the Ubuntu minimal install so that it doesn't install loads of packages. The other issue I wanted to mention was that if I just switch across to my few bits of text here is with the Ubuntu setup. I also tried Mate first of all, instead of the regular Ubuntu Gnome installer. And what I found was the Ubuntu Mate installer didn't recognize my Wi-Fi card. So I ditched that idea and just went with stock Ubuntu 20.04 LTS, the GNOME version, and did the minimal installer. And I'll just cover some notes that I went across, came across actually having to set up the Dell XPS15 for Ubuntu. And basically, the Dell XPS15 comes with Ubuntu, with Windows 10 installed. And so what I wanted to do was actually grab the license key that comes with the computer before I actually nuked Windows. So my idea was that, perhaps I could set up Windows 10 in a virtual machine under Linux and then use the Windows license key. I haven't got that far yet, so I don't know if that will actually work, but this is how you can find the license key on Windows. If you've bought a computer and it's come with Windows 10 Home, for instance, and you want to save the license key, this is the command that you will run on Windows. So on Windows, what you would do is search for the command prompt, and you right-click and select Run as Administrator. And then once you've done that, you enter this command down here, WMIC path software licensing service get, and then OA3X original product key. And then what this does is it actually prints out the Windows license that's sort of, comes with your machine that you bought. So that might be useful if you want to use the license. I don't know if you can use it on another machine or in a VM, but I just thought that'd be a good idea before I sort of wipe the Windows install. And the next thing that I came across was actually setting up the BIOS on the Dell machine, and the tweaks that you need to do to actually run Linux and Ubuntu. So first of all, before you wipe Windows, what you need to do is follow some steps. What you need to do is actually search for Dell Update on Windows. So in the Start menu, you select, start typing Dell Update, and it will open up a little program, and basically it will say, you're gonna update the BIOS. So it will basically run the Dell updater and then update the BIOS and everything to the latest version. And then once I did that, I booted into the BIOS, and I think that's F2 on the Dell. So basically, when you sort of boot up, you have to press F2, and it's the you don't from memory, you don't actually press the function key in F2, you just press the F2 key. And then this will boot you into BIOS. What you need to do is actually switch from RAID to AHCI mode. And this is essential for Ubuntu to be able to install. So what you have to do is switch from RAID to AHCI mode in the disk section, I think it is. And yeah, let me just go through this in a little. Yeah. Okay, so I think what I needed to do was in Windows, I sort of search for command and then do run as administrator. And that's right, what you actually need to do, I think, before you can boot into the BIOS and change it, is you actually need to run bcd edit /set safe boot minimal. So say on Windows, what you do is you type command in the search bar and then click run as administrator, and then you run this command bcd edit set safe boot minimal, and that sets safe boot. And then what I did was restarted the computer and entered the BIOS setup. So basically, yeah, you press the F2 key repeatedly during the setup, and you got to get the timing right, and then it will go into the BIOS. Now, and I said this is the bit where I was just talking about. So after you've run that command to set the safe boot minimal, and you've restarted and entered the BIOS, what you have to do is go to the system configuration in the BIOS and change the SATA operation from RAID to AHCI. You then save the changes and then boot into Windows, and it will boot into safe mode. And once you've booted into safe mode, what you do is you type command and then right click on it and run as administrator. And then what we do is we run bcedit /delete value safe boot. And then after we've done that, we reboot once more into Windows, and it will start with the AHC drivers enabled. And if this works, you should be able to search for the device manager in the Windows search bar, and under the IDA folders, you should see AHCI listed. Okay, so I'll leave a link to this document under the video, but there's just some steps I've come across actually getting Ubuntu working on this machine, and getting things like xmonad working properly with a Gnome session. So I'll come to that soon. So after we've changed this, it's going to allow us to boot into Windows. Now, what I think I did was after that, I rebooted back in. Actually, when I was setting the BIOS, I also changed the fast boot to through in post behavior, and this was a note I found on the Arch wiki about the Dell XPS15. So once you've done all that, and say this is the bit I got to with the ZFS root encryption, and I've just been covering. This is how we set up the user share ubiquity ZSS ZSYS-setup file that I mentioned with the video, and this is basically how it looks. We search for the Z pool create, and then we would echo the password in single quotes before and pipe it into the Z pool create, and then before the last line of the command, we added these lines and then ran the Ubuntu installer. So those are some of the notes I come across about the Dell XPS15 and Ubuntu. And the other thing I was going to mention is the let me just come across to here. I haven't actually got the menu here, but if I just open files, what I found is you can start your sort of session either through a graphical login manager or using StartX and xinitrc. So what I do normally is actually disable GDM and set up a text login so that I would sort of log in as StartX. Let me just come across, and what I found was wiki PS15. While I'm remembering this, if you've got a Dell XPS15, there's some good notes on the Arch Wiki. But what I was going to mention is that if you run StartX and start up xmonad, for instance, which I'm running here, what happens is you get like you can install like little menulets, like for the network manager, for instance, and you can also open your GNOME applications that were installed. What I found was when I was running StartX, what would happen is if I clicked on the network manager up here, it would take like 30 seconds to open. And I've got the exact same setup on another machine, so I knew there was nothing wrong with my setup. It was something particular to this machine, and I figured out it must be the NVIDIA graphics card that wasn't being properly used when just running it from a sort of StartX session using xinitrc. So what I had to do was use GDM to log in to what I had to do was use GDM to have the graphical login and log into Ubuntu, log into my xmonad session. The thing is, when you're using, so basically what it's doing is when you use GDM and you log into xmonad, when you install xmonad on Ubuntu, it has a GNOME flashback xmonad file where it will sort of start a GNOME session and run xmonad on top of it. And what this allows you to do is actually get everything working properly. So what I found was I actually had to, where is it? My desktop. Okay. Normally when you're running, when you start using StartX, you can use an xinitrc file and specify options that you want to happen when you launch the session. So you can swap the keyboard layout, you can set a desktop picture and various things like that. But if you're using GDM, you're using graphical display login manager, the xinitrc isn't used. So the reason this is an issue is because the GNOME desktop can do weird stuff like what you can have is an issue where GNOME sets the wallpaper, but it doesn't sort of take effect in xmonad. And what happens is when you switch to a new desktop, what happens is xmonad kind of draws the previous desktop image as the wallpaper. So you get this weird thing where, for instance, this window, if I switch to a new window, this window here would actually become the kind of like the desktop wallpaper. And it's really baffling. So what I found was I tried setting the startup scripts using, you can set startup scripts in Ubuntu, but that didn't work. So what I actually did was created a shell script that I manually run after I've logged in that actually swaps the keyboard layout on the Dell, because one thing I should mention is on the Dell, the keyboard layout is on the bottom left is Control, Function key, Super key, and Alt, which means that the Control key is at the far left. And what I do is you can't actually move the position of the Function key in the BIOS, I don't think, and you can't move the Function key position using things like setxkbmap in Linux. So what I do is I actually swap the position of the left Alt and left Control key so that the layout is, instead of being Control, Function, Super key, Alt, would be Alt, Function, Super key, Control. So the Control key, is, you want, the Control key is frequently used in Linux, and you want it right, by the X and C keys, because you're going to be pressing it constantly. You don't want it on the far left of the keyboard. So that's the first thing you need to do, is actually swap the left Alt and left Control key. Now, if you're using, if you're not using xmonad and you just want to use the Gnome desktop, what you can actually do is install Gnome Tweaks, and in Gnome Tweaks there's a keyboard section, advanced options, and in there's a way to set this up using a GUI. So instead of running a command, you can actually tick a checkbox in the keyboard configuration in the Gnome Tweaks that will actually swap the left Alt and left Control keyboard buttons on the laptop. So if you're using Gnome, you can use Gnome Tweaks to set that. If you're using another desktop, you can manually set it using setxkbmap in a shell script. But as I said, you're going to want to actually not run xinit RC and StartX on Dell XPS15, I found, because the doing that doesn't seem to allow you to launch the Gnome applications quickly. I mean, literally, it was taking 20-30 seconds just to open the Network Manager applet. And I said, once I've booted into Gnome, if I'm running the Gnome desktop, it doesn't take that long at all. I'm running xmonad under the Gnome flashback, means that all the Gnome applications will start quickly, and I'll just show you some Gnome applications that open and some that don't work so well. So first of all, we remapped Control to Alt on the keyboard. And the next important thing is, in this script, is actually using Fay, which is a wallpaper setter, to set the wallpaper on the desktop. And this is vital because, as I said, otherwise what happens if you're running xmonad under xmonad flashback, what happens is, as I say, you get this weird thing where it will set the previous window as a new Windows wallpaper background. So as I said, if I switch to a new desktop, if I just close this for a sec, if I was to switch to a new desktop, the background would be the previous window. So you'd get this weird effect where you think you're actually interacting with the window, but it's not. It's set the previous windows as a background. And also what I do is use this classic Mac desktop from Tiger as my wallpaper. So that's the other thing that you're actually going to want to do. And I said, there are startup applications in Gnome. There's a sort of section called startup applications, like a little graphical program. You can say, okay, start this program when I log in. And what I tried doing is putting these commands in the Gnome startup applications but it had no effect when I'm launching xmonad. So that's why I'm setting these manually in the script and running the script manually when I log in, because I haven't figured a way to do it automatically. And the other thing that I do is I use the xset command to set the cursor prompt to the left pointer, because by default with xmonad, what will happen is the pointer here will actually be an X, which sort of a bit confusing, because that X is sometimes used in programs that will be used to kill a window. So it's a bit strange because you have this big X and it's just like, I'm going to kill the window or something. So that's how we set the cursor to the left pointer. So I said what I do is, let me just come across here as well. Another thing I should mention is I also have another script that sets the mapping for my external keyboard. So what I can do is I can change the layout on my the laptop's keyboard, and what I can also do is use setxkbmap to set the layout for my Ducky USB mini keyboard without affecting the layout on the laptop, because they have different keyboard layouts. So basically what you can do with the setxkb command is you can actually list the devices. I think it's with X input. Let me just, I think it's X input, X input. Yeah. Okay, so if I run X input, what you'll see is I've got the virtual core pointer here and the virtual core keyboard. And if you come down here, you'll see we got the Ducky 12 mini RGB, and it's listed with an ID of 11. It's also listed with an ID of 13 and 14, but the ID of the keyboard here is 11. And what that allows us to do is we can use that information with the setxkb command to create a layout that only affects that keyboard. So by running setxkbmap with device-11 and then the options, these options will then only apply to the external keyboard and won't affect the layout of the internal keyboard. So I can set the layout to GB, variant Mac, and here what I'm doing is I'm swapping left Alt Control and left and Alt Super Win, so that on my Ducky keyboard I have a layout of Alt Super Key and Control, which is what I prefer, so that I can have the same sort of setup on the internal keyboard and my external keyboard, and I can change the settings on either of them without affecting the other one. And to say this is a script that I just run when I start up. So when I start up the computer, I run the Ducky keyboard script, which sets the layout for that, and then I run the my desktop script here, which, as I was saying, basically swaps the keyboard layout on the Dell's internal keyboard so that it's not control function super alt, it's alt function super control. And again, set the wallpaper and set the pointer. And these are just some things that I've come across. And what I'll do is I'll just come across and open a new window here and launch some Gnome applications. So, for instance, I can open the files. This is the Gnome, file manager. And as I said, the reason why I'm using Gnome instead of, say, Mate is because what I found was during the setup, running the installer for Mate, it didn't recognize the Wi-Fi card, whereas stock Ubuntu did, worked out the box no problem. So this is like open the file manager, and by Gnome, I can run the Gnome settings. Will it open? See, sometimes some of the Gnome stuff doesn't open, and sometimes it does. It can be a bit sort of flaky. So, as I said, like the Gnome settings there, see, it's not opening. Whereas sometimes it will open, sometimes it won't. Some of the other things I've come across, I'm using the GUFW, which is a graphical front end to IP tables, and what I've noticed is if I try and launch this application here in xmonad, it will fail, it won't open, and the reason for that is that on Ubuntu Gnome, if you run GUFW from your application launcher, it will come up with a prompt saying, you need to enter your admin password, and then it will launch the application. But on xmonad, it's not doing that, and I'm guessing that may be something to do with like something like policy kit or something. It's not, or Rofi, or I don't know. But basically it doesn't launch the admin prompt. Let me see if the pulse audio volume control. Okay, you can see here I've got the pulse audio volume control. So this is have you control. So that lets me set the audio sources and stuff in xmonad, and so I've got the network applet running. It's just running in a different desktop window. So this is sort of going through some of the the applications and what works and what doesn't. Passwords and keys, that works. So passwords and keys is your like shush keys, GPG keys, that sort of thing. A lot of these things will work. The Gnome tweaks, Gnome disk. Fonts doesn't work. Trying to run the fonts program, the Ubuntu fonts program just sort of kind of launches, draws a few fonts, and then crashes. So I say there are some Gnome applications that won't play nicely and won't run. Is the calculator? See, the calculator is all spaced out because it's set to go full screen in xmonad. But there's the calculator. So some of these programs, this is the startup applications that I tried using to start scripts up in xmonad instead of having to run them manually, but that didn't work. So a lot of these things, here's the advanced network configuration. So you can actually use this to configure your Ethernet or Wi-Fi, in addition to running the network manager applet. So I said there are some applications like the main settings for Gnome. Yeah, see if it'll launch. It won't launch. There are some applications that don't actually run properly in the Gnome flashback session. So, that's a bit of an issue. But I said I found that you do have to run the flashback session with the Dell XPS15 instead of using an Xinit RC, because what happens is literally any of those Gnome applications would take about 30 seconds to launch otherwise, and the network manager, the NM applet, a network manager applet would take 30 seconds to show up when you click the button. So that's why you do need to run the flashback session, so it's kind of running a Gnome session, because as I said, otherwise a lot of these things wouldn't work. His Chromium, okay, his Chromium's working, and I cover on Chromium. There is a what is it? Local share applications. On Ubuntu, Chromium is a snap package, and what I found is I made a video about this, is that by default your application launchers might not search the location of the snap package desktop files, and so you wouldn't be able to launch Chromium. So for instance, I'm using Rofi here, but when I type Chromium, it wouldn't show up by default. And as I said, I made a video about this, and the fix was to copy the Snaps desktop launcher into local share applications. And once I've done that, the snap package launcher shows up in Rofi, my application launcher. I don't know why the icon's not showing up for some reason. The path must have changed, so I'll have to alter that desktop configuration file. But that's basically just some stuff I've come across setting up Ubuntu on the Dell XPS15 with encrypted root and encrypted datasets for some added security. And if you come across and search for something like Arch Wiki Dell XPS15, there's lots of notes that you can follow about the XPS15 and setting it up. But pretty much I found out the box after I'd done all the BIOS tweaks. That I mentioned in this guide, sort of first of all saving the license, and then sort of going through all these BIOS tweaks that you have to run the Dell updater first of all to update the BIOS. Then you switch to the safe boot minimal, and then you restart and press F2 to boot into the BIOS and change the SATA configuration from RAID to AHCI. And apply the changes. Then you need to sort of boot back in to Windows, and then delete the safe boot value, and then reboot. And once you've done that, you should see that you've got AHCI set up on Windows. And after you've done that, you can basically shut Windows down, put in the Ubuntu USB installer stick, boot up Ubuntu, and you can then run the installer and set up ZFS root encryption. And basically, I say, once you've done that, it will create a ZFS encrypted drive, which will then allow you to create data sets and encrypt them. So I said, if I come back across and list all the data sets, by default it creates a boot pool and an R pool. And boot pools for obviously for the boot stuff, and the R pool contains the boot and our user data. And so what we then did was, in the R pool, D pool, ZFS pool, we created a data set inside of there, which would be then encrypted. So basically, the advantage of ZFS on Linux is that with Ubuntu, the ZFS setup is baked into the kernel, whereas in Debian it's an external module you kind of got to build and load and all that kind of stuff. So +1 for Ubuntu, even though it's not, it's not cool. You're supposed to, use Arch Linux and faff about, but really, I used to use Arch Linux, and it's an absolute pain to set up and to build. So personally, I'd rather just plug something in and get going, actually then get into building my desktop and everything, rather than having to spend ages with obscure commands, faffing about late at night setting stuff up. So what we can then do is, once we've got ZFS set up, we can actually create data sets and apply different options to them. So we can have an encrypted one, we could have something that uses the dedupe ZFS function, which actually duplicates files, so we'll create a sort of copy of the file. But basically, as I said, we created the data set and set a mount point, and as I said, what that allows us to do is have a data set that is encrypted, and we can mount and unmount to keep our sort of passwords and stuff safe. Easy to remember the commands: ZFS mount, rpool, the name of the data set. We've got the got my password store, and what I actually do is I create a directory, and I put all my stuff in there, but I set it up as a Git directory. I set it up under Git so that I can easily push the contents of this to another machine. So I can, on another machine, I have shush running, and I can push that Git repository to the other machine. And what it means is that on all my other machines, I can just pull the Git repository down, and I've got all my passwords synced up, basically. And on my other machines, on the Mac, I'm using an encrypted DMG. On my old Ubuntu setup on my MacBook Air 2011, I'm using a Lux encrypted container, and I've got another old MacBook running FreeBSD, and on that I use ZFS and Jelly to create an encrypted container. But this is much, much easier than using Lux or Jelly and ZFS, where you have to create a file. Like using DD, you'd create a fake file, like a 1 or 2 gig file, and you'd have to use a loopback device and mount the file to the loopback device and encrypt the loopback device. It's a right palaver. It is doable, but it's just long, and this is much, much quicker. So ZFS umount, remember it's umount, not unmount, and then the rpool data. And one thing I should mention here that's quite interesting is that you will actually get auto completion for the mount command, but not for the unmount command. So if I run sudo ZFS mount tab, I will actually get completion for the ZFS pool and dataset. So rpool. Okay. So that gives me completions, but if you run sudo ZFS umount, you don't get any completions for some reason, which is a bit weird, but I don't know why that is. But basically, this will allow you to create encrypted datasets which can have different passwords from your root from your ZFS root, and you can set different mount points for them. So you can have lots of different datasets under rpool down here. Create lots of different datasets, and they can all have different mount points and different encryption options set. And also, as I said, you can either use a passphrase, or you can actually use a file as the key. So you can actually use a file that you've created with DD, and you can use DD and udev random to create a file that you would then use as the key to unlock the dataset, and as I said, you could probably put that on you can specify the location of that key, and you could probably put that on a USB key that you'd plug into the computer, and when you'd boot up, it would sort of look on that. It would look for the key on the external USB drive, and then decrypt the dataset. But say I don't think you can use a key and a passphrase at the same time, which is something you can do with Jelly, for example. So that's basically some things I wanted to cover about getting ZFS set up on Ubuntu, encrypted root partition, and encrypted datasets that you can mount and unmount to keep your passwords and secure sensitive information secret and not lying about on the computer. And I put a link to this video and the this page here under the video. Come through. I think it's about you see it's about 3 or 4 minutes into the video down here. He actually sort of starts mentioning how you set this up, and in this video he was actually using Mate version of Ubuntu, but I would just recommend using the stock 2004 Gnome version with a minimal install, because I just found it worked better than the Mate version. Or I didn't go through and try any other flavors of Ubuntu, but I think the Ubuntu teams probably work more on the main Gnome thing than any of the other sort of flavors, so you'll probably have better luck. So this is the video about setting up the encrypted ZFS root pool, the commands that you need to run, and say once you've done that, you'll then be able to create encrypted ZFS datasets that you can use as an alternative to using Lux and Crypt setup to create encrypted containers, or having to use some third-party thing like VeraCrypt or Gnome NKFS, is it? Or NKFS, which has got security vulnerabilities and you shouldn't be using anyway. So the advantage of this is it's going to be built into the system. You don't have to use any third-party things. You don't have to faff about with DD to create files and loopback devices and encrypt them like you would with Lux. One command to mount, one command to unmount. And as I said, when you boot up into Ubuntu, you'll be prompted for the main ZFS root password, and you will then also be prompted for the password for the encrypted dataset as well. And once you've logged in to Ubuntu, what you'll find is that the dataset has been mounted to the mount point, and during that session you won't have to enter your passphrase again because it's cached in memory for the session, and you will still be able to easily mount and unmount the full sudo cfs unmount. You don't even need a script for this to launch it, because typically if you're using Lux or something, you're gonna have to write your own script to mount the container and all this kind of stuff. With this, it's just 2 commands to either mount or unmount the drive, the dataset rather. So it's really easy to remember, baked in, and you've got the benefit of using ZFS. And one thing I said previously is that I don't think you can use ZFS send and receive from an encrypted dataset to an unencrypted dataset. I think, or you might be able to, but there's some sort of caveats or something. So that's just sort of one thing. But what I actually do is I use rsync to back up my main machine to other machine over SSH, and what I do is I mount the the dataset before I do an rsync backup. So what happens is when I do an rsync backup, it's set to back up everything in my home directory, so it will back up the mount directory and all the files in it. Because otherwise, if I did a backup without the dataset mounted, the passwords wouldn't be backed up using rsync. So if you're doing a backup, what you're going to want to do is actually make sure that the encrypted dataset is mounted when you do before you do the backup, so that it is included in the backup. So you mount it, run rsync. Once you've finished with rsync and doing your backup, I'll just show you here that I don't get the auto completion here. See, unknown ZFS subcommand umount. I'm pretty sure it is. I mean, it's, you know, works. I don't think there is a ZFS unmount command. So rename list get grade mount. Oh, there is one called unmount. I was always using umount instead of mount, but it looks like there is an unmount. So okay, sudo ZFS unmount. So umount works if the unmount work. Rpool data. Okay, so it is unmount. But for some reason there must be some kind of legacy command that or shortcut for umount. So that so that's unmounted. So to mount ZFS mount, we get the auto completion. Okay, right, and then sudo ZFS unmount. Yeah, so you get the completion. Whereas if I use umount, which also works, I don't get the completion. Then rpool unmount rpool data. Okay. So we've got ZFS sudo ZFS mount, and then the pool, and then the dataset, and then to unmount sudo ZFS unmount, and then the pool and the dataset. So I'll update the my notes about that. You do get auto completion for the unmount. I thought it was a bit odd. It's just that there is a umount command as well, which is obviously some kind of legacy thing or something or other. But I'm used to using it on FreeBSD version of ZFS. So as again, this is easy to remember. You'll get auto completion to mount and unmount the encrypted dataset, and as you could see, I'm not having to enter the passphrase to decrypt anything because it's cached in memory for this session. And I guess if I were to, I'm not sure, I haven't tried logging out and then logging back in, that might mean that you'd have to enter the password. But definitely when you boot up, it will actually prompt you for the ZFS root password and the datasets password. So just bear in mind that if you create multiple datasets, so if you were to create multiple datasets with different sort of encryption keys, you are going to be prompted for those when you boot up. So if you create 4 or 5 encrypted datasets, you would then be prompted for the ZFS root password and the password for every single data set that you have created before the computer would boot up. So that's just something to bear in mind. And so everything's going to be encrypted anyway, but I like to have a encrypted container for my passwords and stuff that isn't mounted. So, you know, I don't want all my passwords lying around in plain text on the computer. So this is a good way of having everything encrypted, not mounted. Allows us to mount it. We can then easily back everything up with rsync when it's mounted, and keep the password store under a Git repository as well. So that's just some notes I've come across getting xmonad and Ubuntu set up on the Dell XPS15 with encrypted ZFS root and encrypted datasets for passwords, and everything's working really well. All the keyboard backlight works. All the ports are working. I'm using a 2019 model, which has the it's 15, 2019. Is it 1719? Yeah, it's this one here. So this is the Dell XPS15 last year's model, which comes with an HDMI port and sort of USB A3 ports, whereas the 2020 model it doesn't have an HDMI port and is all USB-C. So the last year's model was cheaper and had the ports that I wanted, so I didn't have to go and buy loads of dongles or a dock or something. So I got the Dell XPS 15. I didn't get it from here. I got the cost a bit more than that, but basically I got it with a 16 gig of RAM, the NVIDIA graphics card, and a terabyte hard drive. So Dell have got some Black Friday sales on at the moment, with a lot of price reductions. The last year's models of stuff, as well as this year's model. But the Dell XPS 15 is pretty heavy. You can't open it with one hand, but the display is absolutely brilliant. The keyboard's fine to type on, no issues with that. As I say, the only issue I'm going to come across with this is it's got a funky layout for the bottom left hand keys, in that the layout is actually Control Function Super Key and then Alt. So you're going to want to swap the left Alt and Control keys, because otherwise it's a bit of a stretch. It's absolutely fine with Ubuntu. There's no issues. Everything works. All the ports work, and the only thing, as I said, is that you're going to want to make sure that you run a Gnome session. So, as I was saying, when you install Ubuntu, when you install xmonad rather on Ubuntu, it will install a Gnome flashback. So, what is it? User bin, something like Gnome flashback. You can find Gnome flashback. I think it's called. There was a file. No, called. Oh, I don't know why it's not finding it. I must be doing something wrong. There is a file somewhere called Gnome Flashback xmonad or something other, and that launches a Gnome session and then xmonad on top of it. And if you don't do that and you just run startx, seems like the graphics card's not used properly, because trying to launch any GNOME application or even just an applet would mean that you'd have to wait about 30 seconds for it to start up. So you're going to want to launch the flashback, that's it. There's the sort of GNOME flashback that xmonad uses. I said normally. So this is my xinit RC that would normally use, and I was using on my previous setup. And as you can see down here, I've got the commands that I'm running in my desktop script to swap the keyboard layout, set fay, and then sort of run xmonad. And what I tried doing, that's what it's called user bin gnome flashback xmonad. So this is the sort of GNOME flashback xmonad session file. It sort of runs a GNOME session, and I think it's this disable acceleration check or something that they have in there that enables graphics card to work properly under xmonad, because as I said, just running startx with xmonad had a lot of issues actually launching certain applications and also applets, but using the GNOME flashback session actually seems to sort of fix a lot of those issues. As I said, there are some GNOME applications like the GNOME settings that sometimes it will open, sometimes it won't. But the advantage is I have this set up so that if I quit xmonad, it will actually return me to the Ubuntu login screen, the GUI graphical login screen, so that I can then type in my password and then select Ubuntu GNOME, so I can easily switch between standard GNOME desktop and xmonad if need be. Whereas if you're using startx, if you've disabled GDM and set where is it? It's the so normally what I do is when I'm setting up a window manager, I would disable the graphical login by setting the default to multi-user target and disabling GDM, which is the login manager thing. And you would then have to edit grub and change the grub command line from quiet splash to text, and then you would run sudo update grub. And basically what this will do is, if you do this, it disables all the graphical login stuff, and you're just prompted with a command line to enter the passphrase and to log in and then run startx. But the issue is, if you do this, you can't then run GNOME. You can't easily log back into GNOME, a GNOME session, because the GNOME desktop actually requires GDM3 to be enabled. So problem is, if you disable GDM3 and set the boot to only boot into text mode, not graphical user mode, you can't switch back to a Gnome session from xmonad because GDM3 is not enabled. So it's a bit of an issue if you need to sort of launch an application that only runs under the Gnome session. So that's why I actually ended up using the Gnome flashback, because it enabled a lot of things to work that wouldn't otherwise. And as I said, there are some issues with using Gnome flashback as opposed to xmonad RC and the StartX. In that you can't use xmonad RC to actually launch applications that you want when you log into the session, and there's this weird issue with it Gnome setting the wallpaper and using the previous window as a new wallpaper, and that's something that's a bit weird. And you know, there's some things you can't change the keyboard layout and stuff too easily. So there are some pros and cons to Gnome flashback as opposed to StartX, but I found you actually have to use it to get the graphics card working properly on the Dell XPS15, because otherwise it didn't seem to play right. So that's just a rather long-winded explanation of ZFS encryption on root, datasets, some notes on the Dell XPS15 and getting it set up, and you know how you boot into the BIOS and set the BIOS and then install Ubuntu with ZFS on root and encryption. And this is the first non Apple Mac laptop, first laptop that's not Apple since the ZX Spectrum 81 I've had. So I've been using a MacBook Air 2011 11-inch for the past 10 years. I've got a picture of it, yeah, little thing here, and they got a better picture than that. Got a picture, find a bloody picture. No, you're going to show me the picture? I'm going to go to the images then. Yeah, one of these. There we go. So I switched from using an 11-inch with 4 gig of RAM to a 15-inch with 16 gig of RAM. So it's a good upgrade. And I said I got last year's model of the Dell XPS 15 with 16 gig of RAM and a terabyte, which worked out cheaper than getting a new MacBook with all the stuff soldered on. And yeah, I wouldn't say the Dell XPS 15 is that portable. It's pretty heavy. It's about 4.5 pounds, so it's a bit of a weight. But you know, I could always whip out the old MacBook Air if I wanted to go somewhere, which is not very likely at the moment. But there you go. So that's some notes on the Dell XPS 15 2019, to show you what it looks like. One of these jobbies. Yeah, they're really nice. Backpad's great. Screen's really good. Speakers, I wouldn't say they're as good as as sort of, you know, some of the MacBook stuff, but they're pretty decent. And only thing I haven't tried is the SD card reader, but everything else is working perfectly under Ubuntu. Sometimes the fans kick in, but not too much. And yeah, I'd say it's a pretty good machine to run Ubuntu on, and works really well with OBS Studio and all my hardware. So yeah, that's just some notes I've come across on getting this set up running Ubuntu. And if you're looking for a sort of new laptop that works out the box with Ubuntu, then some Dell machines might be worth having a look at. I did look at the ThinkPads, but they're terrible. Awful screens, massive bezels, overpriced and underperforming. So I think Dell's probably the best bet if you're looking for a new laptop. And so there are some Dell Black Friday 2020. I'll search on Google. I think there's you come across Black Friday deals. There's a load of stuff here on laptops, and let me just turn off all my things. Deals for home. Deals for home. Laptop deals. I think I went for XPS deals. Laptop deals. Yeah, but if you come down here, they've got a load of last year's stuff. With quite a lot off. 300-400 quid off the previous models. So if you're wanting to get something, the Dell Black Friday sale may be only on for another week or two. So it might be worth having a look and seeing if you can pick up a bargain. As I said, I went with something for 16 gig of RAM, a terabyte hard drive, and a graphics card. I think it's the previous generation's processor. So I didn't go for the latest processor. I just went for last year's. So that's where I got my laptop from, and it works perfectly with Ubuntu 2004. Not too much hassle to set up. It's only the actual the Windows side of things is actually the hassle. Updating the BIOS and enabling AHCI and safe boot and turning safe boot on. That's the bit that takes a while. Once you actually get to installing Ubuntu, plug in the drive, edit the ZFS configuration file to set up full disk encryption, and run the installer, and you're all good to go. I'd just recommend using the minimal Ubuntu installer, and once you do that, it will whiz through, set up Ubuntu. It was actually so quick setting up Ubuntu that I set the installer to run, and I went downstairs, made a pot of tea, and I came back and it was done. So works really well, easy to set up. Everything works, even in actually even when I'm running xmonad, all the keyboard backlighting automatically works on the keyboard. There's no issues that I've come across in the last week or so running this, and it makes an absolutely brilliant Linux computer as a desktop. 15 inches, a good size for the screen, but it plugged into an external monitor, USB DAC, keyboard, camera, microphone, everything worked out the box, no issues at all. So if you're looking for a new bit of kit, you might want to check out the Dell Black Friday sales and get yourself a good deal. So I got, I think my one was about 1,500 quid, which is cheaper than a new MacBook. And there's lots of stuff down here. If you can just search the XPS section. I think I just went to the XPS15 section. Yeah. So if you come to the Dell XPS15 section, you've got the XPSs and new XPSs, and you have a look through here. There was one for 1649, but I think the one I went for was 1,500. come down. Yeah, this looks like the one. Is that it? $16 gig of RAM. Saying it's a 256 drive there. What I got one for with 1 terabyte. Let me just scroll down, see if I can find which one it is. There was a Dell XPS15 for might be this one. Right. No, that's a 512 solid state hard drive. Maybe they've changed. Maybe they changed it. Maybe that deal's gone. Yeah, but down here, there somewhere there was one for 1500 with a 1 terabyte drive. See, these ones are all 512. They may have actually run out of the 1 terabyte drive ones, but you can still get a 16 gig of memory, an i9 processor, and actually have the HDMI port and USB ports rather than USB-C. And the other thing to note is that the Dell XPS 13 don't have a graphics card. They just have the CPU and what have you. So if you want an external, I was looking at the 13 inch. Why are they listening 13 inch? The 13 inches don't have a graphics card, whereas the 15 inch do. So why is it showing all 13 inch ones? Still, let me just scroll down here, see if I can find a bloody laptop. No, that's 8 gig. Yeah, but still, you can get a couple of £100 off last year's model. So worth having a look around there. And I said the one I got, 1 terabyte hard drive, 16 gig, graphics card, £1,500, which works out cheaper than MacBook. Come across to Apple or something. Don't know what the new MacBook's like. That's a new MacBook. Film. Doesn't actually. Where does it tell you how much to play? I think that's probably like 16. Yeah, it's 1,500. See, that's got an i5. Well, I think was mine an i7? Yeah, no, mine's 9.9. No, it was 9.7. Mine's an i7. That's integrated graphics, I think. 500 gig. Is that the 13? Let's say 13 inch. But yeah, I mean, even the more expensive one down here is £1,800. And not as good as specs as the Dell, I'd say. And yeah, they've got the T2 chips, so I don't even know if you can install Linux on these. And they've also got these stupid touch bar things. So if you want a laptop, come out and check across and see if there's any good deals on the XPSs or various models of Dell, and just run Ubuntu 20.04 and it all works perfectly. I'll stop now because I've been going for a bit, and hopefully that will get you set up with ZFS, encrypted datasets, and some notes on getting Ubuntu running on the Dell XPS 15.